morning, everybody. Good morning, I think. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to be a little short on some of the numbers because I have those notes back there. If you want numbers, I can go forward and take a look at my notes. I can't remember all the numbers, I'll give you approximates. But today what I'd like to do is cover identity theft and cybercrime. Talk a little bit about what it is and how big it is and how it's done, and then most importantly, what you can do to help prevent it. So identity theft, we define that as pretty much anything somebody will do to capture some part of your identity to commit some kind of a crime. Generally the crime is associated with money, but as we'll see, it's not always necessarily monetary, though that's of course a great motivator. And as we'll see, there's many different ways to commit that kind of crime and what those crimes are. And it's important to know first exactly what kind of information, how the crime is perpetrated in order to understand what you need to do to stop it. So as we can see here, we have a whole bunch of different ways in which people can capitalize and create fraud. The first that people obviously think about, it's most in the news, is of course credit cards. You know, people will capture your credit card number or your secret code, information such as that, and use that to make purchases or cash advances. And of course the same with the debit card, which is even more remunerative. And of course you can do that in banking. You can create banking accounts, online accounts, which you can then transfer money, take money out of. You can also apply for loans with somebody else's identity who has a good credit rating and obtain the money, and then of course not worry about repaying. And medical theft. You can use somebody else's good health records to get better rates for medical insurance and obtain different kinds of services and equipment. All sorts of theft in terms of government services, getting refunds from the IRS, that's really somebody else's, and other benefits such as that can be done and are done. Today, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're talking about something that's making as much money collectively on a global fashion than banks. So it's something that is significant. Of course, there's also cybercrime, which is rapidly growing. Still, it's interesting that most of the fraud still, to this day, is mostly offline fraud, not cybercrime. But cybercrime is definitely up and growing. It's been growing since 2010, and we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, you know, being stolen this way. And of course, it's starting to merge. It's what we call the cyber-physical domain. That is to say, information can get cold both in the physical world and then in the cyber world. And then the fraud is committed sometimes in the physical world and sometimes in the cyber world. It goes back and forth. Of course, there's some things, as I said, that aren't necessarily related to money. So I'm going to introduce a term here we call synthetic identity. So synthetic identity is where I'm not necessarily attempting to steal your identity and pretend I'm Len. It's where I'm attempting to get some information, perhaps some social security number that's valid, but making up my own identity. Different name, a fictitious individual, if you will, synthetic. You should know that there's hundreds of millions, there's tens of millions of these kinds of people out there right now with synthetic identity. Now, why would I want to have a synthetic identity? Therefore, Len is not necessarily a victim, nor you in this case. It's a synthetic name. It is possible that in that synthetic identity, I'll want to use an actual social security number, in which case the person who possesses that social security number might find over a period of time as this individual attempts to, let's say, take on bad loans or things like that, their credit rating has gone bad. So they do become a victim, but that isn't necessarily the case. I might be an illegal alien who's attempting to live in this country more legitimately by creating a false identity, in which case I could be a perfectly law-abiding individual, not at all intending to commit any kind of financial crime. I could be money laundering. That would be a good source of it as well. I could be a criminal that's attempting to get a good, clean record with a phony identity. Again, that may not result in any kind of crime. So those kinds of things are done. Of course, Social Security numbers are a good thing to have if I'm attempting to create a synthetic identity. Generally speaking, the kind of Social Security numbers that would be the nicest to have would be a Social Security number of a deceased, because they're not going to notice it too much, or of a young child, because they're not going to notice it too much unless you're opening up 529 accounts and things like that under the name of their Social Security number. Here's another thing that people can do. It's bullying in general. You see that in class. It's a significant problem on the cyber world too. They can really damage people, harass them, track them down, stalk them, and so forth. And of course, finding information about somebody which might trigger you to want to be able to bully them is a serious problem. And in fact, sometimes you could even put up websites or blogs under that individual's name, pretending you're them, and cause them all sorts of embarrassment and possibly even criminal activities. So it's a problem, and it's not done necessarily for money. It's done for meanness, harassment, vengeance, whatever motivation you might have. But it does involve, and sometimes, assuming somebody's identity or finding out enough information to cause them a problem. And then, of course, there's other things that are on the horizon. So there's a term we now call the Internet of Things. We'll talk about that some more, but more and more it's in the newspapers that besides people being connected to computers, computers are being connected to computers, and they're being embedded in everything we own. We have smart thermostats. We have that monitor your power and allow you to change your power from afar. Cameras, kitchens, smart refrigerators, even, as I'll talk about shortly, a car. So these things are also important for bad guys. They can assume your identity, they can take over the control of these things. They can break into homes, find out when you're not there, gain control of assets, and so forth. So there's lots of motivations that occur. And I might want to say that fraud is the kind of thing, it's like sort of like a balloon. So if it blows up here, and I stop doing something to sort of stop it by pressing it in, then you'll find a different form of fraud will occur somewhere else. So I'll touch on that some more when we talk about the credit card fraud for a moment. Well, maybe I'll talk about it now. So with credit card fraud, as you know, people like to steal the credit card, the account number, and so forth, and there's been a lot of theft of the credit cards, and there's now movement to adopt a technology called IMG, which is a smart chip in your credit card that makes it harder to get and detect a counterfeit, to create a counterfeit card. You can no longer just read the magnetic stripe. You're talking about a computer in a card that actually generates a dynamic code. But we find that as that happens, guess what? Fraud moves more to online, where they had it in England and places in Europe. There's more attempt to commit identity fraud and take accounts online, make purchases with credit card numbers online. And of course, there's most recently been more fraud where actually, and we'll touch on that, malware is installed, that's bad software, into the point-of-sale terminals to collect this information. So this gives you some feel for roughly where the type of identity theft is occurring now. I don't know if you can see that too well, but clearly credit card fraud is still high and dominant as the major one. But look out, because we're starting to see, as of 2013 and 2014, new forms of fraud emerging that are starting to grow. And as we close the door on the credit card with the smart card chip and so forth, you will see more and more types of fraud occurring. Medical fraud is rapidly on the rise, for example. So if you say that, I don't have to worry too much about the cyber because I don't go online much. I don't bother with this stuff. I don't do online banking. I don't do any of this kind of thing. So why would I worry? So I just want to tell you, I got this information here from the web. You're on the web with your pictures and so forth. By the way, there's been some clever researchers that have shown that you can get on the web if you have a Facebook account. If you don't, you can find it other ways. I can do searches on pictures like this to find out more information about you. But I did just some, preliminary searches on this. By this morbid, preliminary searches on this, and I found out for many of you, they're not good pictures. Go back and take them. So I took pictures of you, and I found out phone numbers, ages, names, addresses, home addresses, children's names, their addresses, their ages, email addresses when you have it, all this information I got. And many times, some of the people I looked at are frankly friends of mine I know don't use the internet. You don't have to use the internet. You're on that website because you're an officer, not necessarily because you use the internet. If you're on some other kind of board or community service, you'll be on this kind of stuff. In fact, one of the things I found was the New York Times article on you that came out not that long ago that talked about the old guard, and names of the offices, and a whole bunch of other stuff. They even said that some of you are prone to sometimes nod off a little bit. But you don't have to worry too much in this talk, and I'll tell you why. I remember this story. One time there was a well-known actor, and he was doing Hamlet in the theater. And this woman came in with her husband, and they sat down in the front row, and he started to give his soliloquy. And as he did, he noticed that the gentleman had fallen asleep. And that wasn't so bad, he kept going and ignoring it. But then the gentleman started to snore louder. And that just got me. He stopped in the middle of a soliloquy, and he turns to the wife and he says, "Madam, would you please wake up your husband?" And she says, "Certainly not. You put him to sleep, you wake him up." So I'm not going to wake up anybody. Feel free. Of course, there's some people that actually thrive and don't seem to worry about it. These are some millennials. I don't know if you recognize them, but my wife and I, we sort of watch the Bachelorette. This is where you match people up. This young woman had 25 men. She picked this young man here, and they're actually getting married as a result of this. They've been in all the news. It just happened last night. So there's nothing you don't know about these two. We know where they live, what they do, their first names, last names, their family, everything else, and it doesn't seem to bother them. That's the millennials, born from the 80s to the early 2000s. They thrive on it. In fact, I've ventured to say that this young couple, who are both very attractive and personable, been on TV a lot already, will probably leverage this to make a nice small fortune and an income. So they're learning how to use it, but they don't worry. But of course, there is cause for worry. So what do they want? Willie Southern once said, that famous bank robber, he said that I rob banks because that's where the money is. And people take the information because that's where the money is, because it can turn into crime. So they want things like your social security number, bank accounts numbers, bank card numbers, IDs and passwords if you go online. All of that sort of information is the kinds of things that they're looking for that they can turn to money. And by the way, a little bit of information can be leveraged. Okay, we'll talk about that in the ways and means. But if I have a little bit of information on you, I can use that information to do further searches or to phone call centers and pretend I'm you and have further information that way. There was a reporter who's very into this. He works for a magazine called Wired Magazine. It's all about the internet and technology and all that kind of stuff. And he's considers himself a very savvy, knowledgeable kind of guy. And he gets hacked. And all his photos that he has stored up there in the cloud and so forth are all taken away from him. He can't get it back. And he tried to retrace this and recover it. And son of a gun,